everyone from Bangalore here in South India. My name is Paul Dupuis. I'm the MD and CEO of Randstad India. Welcome to this webinar on a very timely and important topic. We're going to talk today about leadership in crisis in times of uncertainty and ambiguity. I thank you all for joining us. I'm joined by two very special presenters today, or panelists. We have Professor Raghunath from the India Institute of Management here in Bangalore, Professor of Strategy, and he's the chairperson for the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship at IIMB. Professor Raghu, as he's commonly known by all of us, has more than 3 decades of experience as a strategy implementation consultant, senior leadership team coach, and he's been an independent board member of banks, venture capital, and on other corporate boards. Professor Raghu, welcome. And we also have Vinay Kumar. Vinay is a founding director at C2C which is an organizational development consulting firm. He's held leadership positions and CXOs in services, education, banking industries, and so on. For the last 12 years, he's been working with organizations and the C-suite, helping to increase effectiveness and to make sure that talent development activities align with organizational strategy. He also is the current global chair of the International Association of Facilitators. So quite a wide range of experience here amongst our group today. Over the next 45 to 60 minutes, we're going to be talking about something that's very important, particularly right now as we're in the middle of an unprecedented crisis, and for leaders, this poses quite a challenge. So we'll begin with Professor Raghu. Let's begin, Professor, as you know well, when things are stable, when things are, let's say, business as usual, there are enough everyday challenges for leaders. But we are, again, in unprecedented times right now. The current leadership challenges with COVID-19 particularly pose unique challenges for leaders. And we'd like to hear from you a little bit on your thoughts on how leaders can handle this current situation.
Yeah, so this is a unprecedented moment in the history of mankind. Companies have challenges, so do societies and governments have challenges. And that being the case, the orientation is one of making sure that we are addressing the disruption which is happening in the area of work, workplace, employees, customers, and the supply chain, and the society faces a complete physical lockdown while being challenged to continue essential supplies and services. At the mental and the psychological level, within the corporates, there is isolation and a not so familiar virtual connect. And at the societal level, it is this challenge of virus containment and anxiety survival, given that in India, you also have a large population of migrant labor. So if we were to really look at the challenges, primarily it is about a disintegrating supply chain, which is not so responsive. Clients who are trying to reconfigure and refigure where do they position themselves, the financial stretch which is happening within the company, and above all, employee protection. In other words, we are all at a point when we are being challenged in trying to address the enlarged concept of what is place all about. We all understood place to be synonymous with physical space. And all of a sudden, we find that physicality is a shunned word. It is all about virtuality. And virtuality obviously brings in its own psychological challenges. And there is this whole issue about how do you really manage what has to be physically delivered while being virtually present in this current setting. I think this, in a sense, is a huge challenge.
Thank you, Professor Raghu. A very interesting point about place. We've all kind of had a wake-up call on what work means. And Vinay, I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on some of the things the Professor talked about.
Yeah, I think the unprecedented is the key word, and I think calling the current environment volatile is an understatement, right? Most organizations are struggling with, they don't know what they don't know. They don't know how long this is going to last. The uncertainty of the future is what's bothering folks. And while we talk about physical, social distancing, Paul, you and I have exchanged notes on this. I just am so worried with that term. I think it's physical distancing. We're not socially distancing. We should be socially connecting using technology, etc. So I think it's more about physical distancing, and we maybe need to change the term from social distancing to physical distancing.
Well, it's an interesting comment. In fact, just in recent days, we're starting to see that people saying, it's not about social distancing. If anything, we're told to be apart, but now's the moment to get closer together. And we see that back to the idea of place. What is work, the future of work going to look like when this is finished? Because we know, like every crisis, eventually it will end. Clearly, there will be some changes. As a CEO of a large, complex organization in India alone, we have more than 70 offices. We put 60,000 people to work every day. It's a huge responsibility as leaders, and I meet with my leadership team every day as we navigate through this crisis. And again, there's no textbooks, there's no playbook on how to handle this sort of thing. But many of us through our careers have led through crisis. If I think about myself, 9/11, the dot-com bubble, SARS, H1N1. I was in Japan, as many people know, for close to 25 years. I was there through the earthquake in 2011 and the tsunami that followed, the nuclear meltdown, and so on. Something about crisis, there's kind of a common denominator that emerges. There's data, there's information that we gather, and then there's emotion. So there's that mixture of kind of logic and emotion. It's tough to make a decision when you're in the middle of this dilemma. And I think of one example recently. So Boris Johnson in the UK took the advice from his chief medical officer, basically their minister of health in the UK, to follow a strategy of herd immunity. And this is a scientific-based approach to handling a virus. Not necessarily a pandemic, but maybe an epidemic. And the idea is to build immunity in the masses, right? And so he took the data, he took the advice of experts, and then he decided to make a decision. And he made a decision. And UK was kind of the odd country out. While everyone else was going into shutdown and lockdown mode and a bit of panic, he said, let's function as per usual, and we'll build up herd immunity. Well, we all saw what happened. About 2 weeks into this herd immunity strategy, he took on a new strategy, and that was to go into lockdown, to go into isolation and social distancing. And I use this example not to knock Boris Johnson. In fact, if anything, it's commendable because as leaders, when we are leading and navigating through the fog like we are right now, sometimes you need to pivot. And sometimes you go with a strategy that's simply not working. To have the guts to pivot is very important, particularly in a crisis. And I would encourage all the leaders on this webinar to think about that. We've all adopted a strategy which was literally built overnight. And it's important that we question that from time to time and know when to pivot. Professor Raghu, I have a question for you. As leaders, how do we respond to these challenges? Think about the short-term, the data, the immense data we have, some of it authentic, some of it not, as we know, with literally with fake news everywhere around us. Things are moving so fast. How can leaders handle this? How can they make decisions during this pandemic?
Right. So basically, what we are saying is that when we have a challenge which is trying to address a systemic failure, we start all the way from the strategic level, from policy making, which has to change, as you said, taking into account the signals which are coming from the marketplace. So as a leader, you actually need a backup scenario building team, which is constantly feeding you data. And I think as a leader, all that one does is to engage in constant communication about the why of the decision. And then when it comes to operational aspects, it is about the direct reports who've got to be left to themselves in terms of making up their plans about what they execute, and the senior leader moves out of the way. And basically he's there just to facilitate drawing out ideas and just offering some guidelines if they require. And then it comes to the tactical level where the direct reports, the teams of the ground, are basically making their decisions. And as a very senior leader, one has to be available to coach, to troubleshoot, to develop that psychological safety that these leaders actually require at various levels. Because I still remember long ago, if you remember Ernest Shackleton, the guy who went to Antarctica, he put out an ad in the Times And the ad read as follows: men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. I mean, that really sums up the challenge of the leader when he has to keep the spirit going, the purpose being extremely strong, and the resolution to engage without giving up. I think that's something which is what leadership actually brings up in organizations today.
No, it's a powerful example. Thank you for that. I'm a big fan of purpose, by the way. Often as leaders, we talk a lot about the what. We talk about targets and goals and ambitions and so on, but we don't necessarily focus enough on the why. And I can tell you, we have data at Randstad across 39 countries about why people join companies, why they stay, why they leave. They don't join a brand. They don't join for the what. They join for the why. Particularly the workforce of the future. And these are the people that are encountering this pandemic and this crisis. Is probably the first big real crisis in their lives if we talk about the younger workforce that's out there right now. And they're looking for leaders that give them a clear why. And I really like that example. Can you imagine hearing that criteria that we just heard from Shackleton and then signing up, knowing all of that? I was excited just listening to it. I'm not sure about the no guarantee of return. That might be a problem. Vinay, but there are no guarantees, as we know, as leaders. It's important to have purpose. Vinay, you have a unique perspective. You coach CXOs daily across borders. You spend a lot of time with leadership teams, of course, facilitating teams in transition, transformation. Based on what you've seen, particularly in recent weeks, how are organizations, how are leaders coping in this crisis? And maybe if you have some ideas on do's and don'ts, we're always good to hear both, let's say, success as well as, not unsuccessful stories.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. There's a quote that's attributed to Martin Luther King, which says, "Only in darkness can you see the stars." And this is the opportunity for leadership to shine as stars. I can just imagine on the backside of COVID-19, how many books on leadership are going to be written, particularly around what organizations did. I think one of the do's is agility. Professor Raghu was just talking about it. How quickly can you make decisions? And the second is, it's very important for leaders to show vulnerability at this stage. There's anxiety at all levels. While leadership needs to demonstrate calm, a leader can't be walking around saying, "It looks like nothing's going to happen, don't worry." So let me just give you a quick example. I was talking to a very senior vice president a couple of days ago, and he was just telling me that he got off a call with his CEO where all the senior leaders were on, and the CEO said, "Don't worry, guys. By mid-May, we're going to be back to normal. Everything's going to be okay." And this VP was telling me, he's like, I don't know how our CEO can say that, and I don't know where he's got that crystal ball from. If he has a crystal ball, why didn't he predict that this COVID-19 would show up in the first place, right? So it's almost this, and he used the term foolish optimism. And the leader's intent may have been great, but I think people can see through it. And sometimes it's just calling out what there is.
Yeah, Vinay, you raise a really good point. And one of the, let's say, objectives of this webinar today is to share ideas with leaders and hopefully get a couple golden nuggets. If I can share one with you, my favorite book, in a way, it's my Bible. Many of you will know this book. It's Good to Great by Jim Collins. Inside this book, there is a story of Admiral Stockdale. It's actually become a theory or a best practice called the Stockdale Paradox. And basically he talks about what you just described, Vinay, Admiral Stockdale. And of course you can read this and we're happy to send you some links afterwards. You can read up on this. It's absolutely appropriate for our current situation. But Admiral Stockdale was in the Vietnam War, was a prisoner of war, and was with the troops, and they were basically kept in horrible conditions. And what ends up happening when you're in a desperate situation, it's human nature to want to be optimistic. We look for comfort. We search out comfort. And that's usually after we speculate to the negative. We've done our speculating to the negative. We've bought in a lot of the rumors that fuel the fire of negativity. And then at one point we looked for comfort. And what these prisoners had done was they said, well, Christmas is coming soon. We're going to get out by Christmas. And suddenly this really kind of took on momentum in this prisoner camp. And Admiral Stockdale stood up and said, no, we're not. And he didn't want to crush the spirit of the people, but what he wanted them to understand is that we shouldn't set false hope. So the leader in times of crisis needs to, of course, keep a sense of hope, but with realism. So he called it confronting the brutal facts. So if we confront the brutal facts in this particular situation that we're in right now, there's ambiguity. We've never experienced anything like this before. There's a very low level of predictability. Therefore, while for example, in an Indian context, while the government has ordered a lockdown for 21 days, there's no guarantee that indeed the lockdown will be lifted on April 15th or April 14th, I guess, midnight. The common sense decision would be to say, for now, it's 21 days, and we will reassess at that moment. So to say that it will be finished magically after 21 days, is a bit of I think it's a good example of the Stockdale Paradox. By all means, please read it. We will send you links after our webinar today. Professor Raghu, this pandemic, It's interesting. I was doing some research yesterday. It actually started in China. We know that. But in fact, did some research and found that the Chinese government actually reported to the WHO on December 31st about a new form of influenza. They weren't sure what it was, but they did, as per the protocol, reported to the WHO with the view that it could become an epidemic, it could spread. On January 7th, they identified the strain. It was a coronavirus, which is a type of flu strain. It's a virus strain. And then on January 11th, this is how fast it moved. The first patient who was diagnosed with the virus died in Wuhan. Well, we know what happened since then. In China, to be fair, while they were hit in such a hard and tragic way, they're also to be commended for some of the ways that they handled and responded to this crisis. And we're seeing a bit of let's say, the bounce back happening now, although again, it's hard to say whether there'll be a rebound or not. I'm interested to hear what are your thoughts and what you've seen in terms of how China has handled this crisis and anything worth sharing with the listeners.
Yeah, sure. So some of the responses that the companies basically had was to set up, I think as a lot of Indian companies have done, is to set up these emergency response teams. And they do the assessment in terms of risks and in formulation of response strategies. And they obviously came up with flexible work arrangements and minimizing on-site work while meeting basic operational requirements. The digital employee health declaration system was extremely critical, so they were tracking the well-being of employees. They were also managing the financial stretch and business continuity to a fair bit of trying to evaluate the financial impact and the liquidity requirements and trying to reformulate in terms of debt restructuring plans, optimizing assets, and also trying to understand the financial impact across the entire value chain, and then revisiting some of their contractual obligations. The supply chain, which obviously is a casualty in such situations, was addressed in a different way in terms of accelerating investments in digital trading solutions, getting better visibility into local access limitations, and primarily trying to promote operational agility and data quality, which are very, very critical in terms of building the supply chain scenario. In terms of customer engagement, they maintained open and ongoing lines of communication with customers and looking at the emergency actions which were being implemented. In summary, basically it was all about the companies realizing that digital capabilities was the need of the day, basically because the no-touch experience became a premium or the most preferred form in terms of moving value as opposed to physical presence. And I think this, in short, in some ways captures what they did in terms of their response to the crisis.
Yeah, interesting observations. I mean, this whole notion of social distancing, and Vinay, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on what you've seen in India, at least so far. But you could say social distancing in a way was created in China. Very creative ways to do that, from the way they were delivering pizzas. If you would have seen how the pizza delivery person would drop the box in front of the home, stand back 2 meters. This was before the WHO had made any conclusions about the virus. Payment would be made through e-payment. They would pick up the box and they would take away the base that they sat the box onto and bring it back to the shop. So there would be no sort of personal connection. Hey, Vinay, if we look at it from let's say a corporate standpoint, companies, leaders out there, and what you've seen, I'm sure you've made some observations here in India, particularly, or across borders. What have you seen in terms of the reaction? Anything that kind of impressed you or didn't over the past month or so?
It's a spectrum, right, Paul? I mean, there's companies that started just looking after their own well-being first. Look at what do we do. Some companies went straight into financial impact and customer impact. Others, there's a couple of organizations I know that started actually looking. The leader said, let's take a look at how this is going to impact our service providers. We're going to stop our cab service. Housekeeping is going to stop. Our cafeteria is going to stop. What's going to happen to those service providers? So they actually started to look at it a lot more holistically, and you're seeing the response from the employees and their ecosystem come back much more positively when organizations and leadership teams have looked at the whole ecosystem versus looking at it, okay, I got to worry about the impact it's got on my revenue, my employees, my financial, and my customers, or whatever it might be. But when you start looking at that whole ecosystem, so I've seen that entire spectrum, and I'm already sensing and seeing and hearing that the organizations have started to look at the full ecosystem of their supply chain, service providers, the security guards, everybody. They're seeing a lot more engagement and support from their system as well.
Interesting. Yeah. We've got lots of questions coming in, gentlemen, which we're going to go to here in a moment. So thank you all who are participating in this webinar for offering up your questions. We'll get to those in a moment. I just want to share a bit of my observation as a Canadian who's been out of Canada for a long, long time, although I'm very interested in what's happening in Canada, having my family there, my son who's in university there as well. And then, of course, in Japan in and out of Japan for some 25 plus years, now in India for 3 years. So I've kind of got my eyes on a few different places. And if I look at some contrast just in what I've seen from an objective standpoint, Japan was hit before the rest of Asia. I'd say China, Japan, and then it started to move into Singapore and so on. Although there was a case in Thailand, but Japan really had the ramp up, particularly with the cruise ship. If you all remember the Diamond Princess, which was in the port in Yokohama, and the handling of that, of course, was questionable. But again, there was no precedent. What ended up happening was the virus incubated on this ship, and several hundred people were then infected with the virus. But along the way, we also had this other key mission, which was to protect the Olympics. The Olympics was coming. So here's a really classic, and I think you're right, there'll be books written about this later, classic leadership dilemma. Something that the country had been preparing for years and years, a moment of pride, the Olympics on the global stage. And we know that Japan will do everything to get it right, just right, and just in time. But then we had the threat of this virus. And so what we've seen in Japan is that while the cases were steadily increasing, when they settled the issue with the cruise, and then moved on from that, and then continued to basically life and business as usual, although many companies adopted work from home. There was no mandate from the government per se. But when the Olympics were postponed, we suddenly saw a spike in cases the very next day, the largest ever one-day increase in number of cases. It brings up the question of testing, right? So whether that was being done before. If we go over to a country like Singapore, for example, where the government is being commended. Now it's a very different environment. It's an island. It's a small population, but the government there has been commended for the way they've handled it and the way they've basically mandated the right behaviors. We come over to India. Very interesting, decision by the leader, the Prime Minister of India, to order a curfew. So they call it the Janta curfew. As a bit of an experiment, a bold experiment, a country of 1.3 billion, to basically ask everybody to stay at home on one day, on that Sunday. This was before, there were well under 200 cases at that point. So this was preemptive. This was kind of a decision that the leader made based on facts and probably a lot of emotion to say, we need to protect the people before it gets out of hand, made the decision. I was absolutely amazed at the response. And of course, any of us that were in India, and those of you who are not in India, you should know this, that in India, normally, I call it in Bangalore, very well known for traffic, I call it the Bangalore Symphony Orchestra. That's the sound of all the horns on the street. It's the organized chaos of India, which I've come to really enjoy. But when that curfew happened, I have an amazing video from my balcony of a 360 of Bangalore in midday. It's absolutely silent, and all you hear are the birds chirping. Now, I wonder if Prime Minister Modi had that as one of his outcomes of that decision. Probably not, but it's a nice outcome, and the skies were blue and so on. Then he moved on and ordered a nationwide lockdown. And the lockdown really meant that essential services would be able to operate beyond that, nothing else. And then it tightened up over the days that followed, as many of us know. And it's interesting to see how leaders across the world define lockdown, define isolation. And it's quite a variety of variants. In Canada, for example, essential services is some 25 different services. Whereas in India, it's very, very clear what it is. Essentially hospitals and pharmacies and some grocery stores, right? The very, very basic. Of course, police and fire. So it comes back to that, point about hindsight is 2020. This is not to criticize any of the leaders of these nations and how they've handled it, but certainly, tough situations call for tough decisions. And we've seen that in India. Now the jury is out. We shall see how this unfolds. There are some serious concerns about the migrant workers, for example, in Delhi. And if you watch these videos, they're, absolutely terrible. These people that are trying to get home, but they're also in very close quarters. So a little bit future focused here for a moment. Yeah, Vinay, I want to come to you and just get your thoughts on some of the things I just said right now. Go ahead, Vinay.
Yeah, Paul, just like you were doing a quick comparison of Japan, Singapore, India, I'll just share an anecdote. In my apartment building, we have employees from various different organizations, including leaders, and all of us are exchanging notes, just like that. How is this company dealing with COVID-19? What is this company's response? What is that company's response? And we are critical of these organizations and that. So I think it's also to link that, we can look at the armchair critics of the political elements, but it is very important for leaders to recognize that employees are also are looking at organization responses and leadership responses under a magnifying glass and making comments.
Yeah,
and at the back end of
agree.
COVID-19, that response will determine future engagement.
Yeah, and it came back to what we said earlier, Professor Raghu, about how in good times, leaders are already in the spotlight, and I would say even in the fishbowl. Your movements and your behaviors are being observed, but even more so in crisis. When you're under duress, when you're under stress, who do you look to? As a child, you look to your parents. As a part of an organization, you look to your leader or your leaders. And so it's very important that leaders step up. I would say this is an opportunity to really grow as leaders, to put on that leadership muscle that we might not normally use, particularly in a crisis. Just want to go to questions for a moment. We've got a whole bunch. Let me just, a question from Anand Babu at Amazon, HRBP at Amazon. The question is, this is for everybody, even as organizations work on ensuring robust BCP plans through this period, they also must start planning for recovery and to put in place a growth strategy for when the time arrives. And hopefully this will just be in a few months. Well, Babu, we hope so. Or Anand, sorry, hope so. Maybe even shorter. But let's not be overly optimistic, as we just discussed. What are the top 3 or 4 things that leaders should focus on right now if we want to be future focused for a moment? So if you push pause and say, a couple of assumptions. This crisis will end. Like all crises, eventually will end. And when it ends, what will happen next? What can be done now? What can leaders do now to kind of set the stage? Who would like to take this first?
Sure.
Vinay?
Yep.
Oh, sorry,
Please,
Professor. No,
yeah.
Professor, go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem. Yeah, Mr. Vinay, please go ahead. Yeah.
Vinay, in a moment.
Okay.
You go.
Thanks, Professor. Go ahead.
Raghu, go ahead.
Oh, okay. We're all telling each other. Okay, fine. So one of the things which is emerging, as you notice, is that we all thought that the corporate world and the governments actually run the world, that the entire global economy was just a discretion of governments and large corporates connected to the entire supply chain and the small and the medium enterprises, and that's what makes the world tick. Now just realize that this very microorganism called a virus is bringing up an important lesson, and that is that for the first time we human beings are realizing that the economy is not essentially run just by governments and corporates, but the community of individuals. I have never seen such a voluntary agglomeration of self-motivated, self-driven, self-directed clusters of people coming in with money, with resources, with the ability to respond like fire brigades would in just a jiffy. And I think what we missed so far in our corporate settings is to understand that it is the community, whether we call that a migrant labor who drives a truck, or a cleaner who cleans up in terms of housekeeping, or all of that. They are the ones who keep the wheels of the economy running. And the responsibility and the responsiveness of the average well-to-do human being in different parts of the world is something that governments and corporates could have not done in the way they have responded to this crisis. And I think if you are talking about business continuity planning, we got to be understanding more about what is conscious capitalism all about. What is this whole business of a circular economy where we all owe our obligations and responsibilities to every member, every stakeholder, the weakest in the power chain.
Yeah, very interesting, Professor Raghunath. I would absolutely agree with you. I mean, while we've been told to be apart, we've come closer together in a remarkable way. Huh? And I think
matter so much. And we, for the first time, are in our societal obligations actually that we can collaboration. And I hope
we have a bit of a lag.
Yeah, sorry, you were saying something.
Yeah. No, that's okay. We got a bit of a lag, even though we're all in Bangalore here. Yeah, there's a bit of a lag, but that's fine. I got the key gist of your message, Professor Raghu. I think you're right. I mean, it's been remarkable how we've all kind of come together. And I think to leverage it back to the question, from Anand, I think part of what we do in setting the stage for the next phase post-crisis is how we engage with people right now. Yeah, and Vinay, you had a comment on this?
Yeah, I think from an organization level, there's so much pressure today, and I like your part about future focus. And it's very important as a best practice for organizations to have 3 different teams. A team of people looking at how do we manage the challenges of today, what do we do for the next few months, another team, and then a third team looking at what are we going to do post-COVID-19, because it's the same person cannot deal with this information overload, deal with the anxiety of today, and also plan for 6 months from now. So dividing up leadership responsibilities or this focus and getting groups of employees to be part of different conversations is very, very important. Can you imagine one person trying to think of future and today? Wow.
Yeah. No, that's actually a good point. And I think, again, it's a very good question. We need to be future focused while also focusing on today. And that's something we do even when it's business as usual, right? But doing it in the middle of a crisis. I can share what we're doing here at Randstad, both in India, but also globally as a global company in 39 countries with some 50,000 more employees. And then, of course, our contractors, we have close to 1 million contractors that we put to work every day around the world, 60,000 here in India alone. So we set up our BCP team. But, BCP, business continuity planning, it's interesting. BCP, if you were to survey 10 different leaders, you would get different definitions of what BCP is. Many people immediately default to IT. It means that our systems continue to work, our processes continue to function, right? In other words, the machine doesn't break. In this case, it's not about that. That's one piece of it. So we set up a BCP steerco, some would call it a task force, which represented really the 4 corners of our organization in India. Of course, the business side, but also the enabling functions, everything from corporate services to facilities and risk and compliance and so on. These are all leaders. And we meet 3 times a week on a regular cadence, first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. And what we do is we gather authentic data So only information that's released by credible sources, of course, the WHO and the Ministry of Health in India. And then we update each other on that. We also start the conversation, though, with how are our people doing? So for us, BCP starts with our people. Are our people safe? That's the most critical question. It starts with that. Once we know that they're safe and they're confirmed that they're safe, of course, we have cases of people that may be showing symptoms, but no confirmed cases necessarily. We need to make sure that they're taken care of. We've had cases of people who are far, far away from home working for us in different locations like Chennai, and they're from somewhere up north, and they're young and they're single, and their parents are asking them to come home, and they can't go home, and they're lonely. So it raises the question of, how do you care for those people? For me, business continuity planning is a phased approach. It starts with, are our people safe? That's the most important thing. Make sure your people are safe. And we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This speaks right to that. Do they have shelter? Do they have food? Do they have necessary medical care if they need it, and so on? And then, of course, the care comes into play, the engagement. So some interesting things that maybe we can talk about in a moment on that. In fact, that's one of the questions that's come up. And I'll club it with one other. So Praveen Mahadavan, from Savita Oil Tech, the HR head there, balancing fear and honest communication with positivity, hope, and a pragmatic approach is a fine art, and it's a necessary one for leaders during this phase. What's your advice for leaders? Well, that's pretty heavy and pretty dynamic and complex, eh? It kind of goes back to the Stockdale Paradox. I'll give it a stab, and of course, Professor Raghu and Vinay, think about this one. I think it first starts with being connected. This is a great moment for leaders to get connected. And, this tech for touch, what we're doing right now, whether it's Zoom or Skype or Google Hangout or even WhatsApp on video chats, and so this opportunity to see each other's face and have a chat, it's really important. That to me is one important thing. I think the other thing is not to instill that false sense of optimism and hope, but to say that, we have challenging times ahead of us. We are going into uncharted territory. But one thing is crystal clear. We're going to get through this, and we're going to get through this together. Good days will follow. It's been proven over history time and time again that good days will follow, and we will be stronger as a result. That kind of messaging to me is critical right now for leaders. There's no sugar-coated optimism in that story. The truth is the leader is sending out a message that I'm holding the wheel and we're going to get through this. The leader also needs to be human through the experience. So, for me, that's one thing. I think the other thing is we need to care for both the mental and physical health of our people. We'll get to clients, customers, and all that next. Of course, that's next. Let's talk about our people first. I'm a big believer in fitness, both physical and mental, emotional fitness. I think it's very important through this challenge, and it's extended, that we take care of ourselves, and we need to encourage our people to do that and come up with ways for them to do that. So, we're doing some things at Randstad, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later, because there are more questions here from a lot of our heads of HR, in fact, that are asking, how can we keep people engaged? How can we keep them healthy, and so on? So I'll push pause for a moment. Vinay, maybe you'd like to comment a little bit about, how you balance that message of hope and positivity while also being pragmatic and keeping people engaged through this extended lockdown.
Yeah, so the first tip I'd say is take the pressure off yourself to get it perfect. There is no perfection because somebody will find another way. I'll give you another quick example. A global CEO, I was watching CNBC, the US CNBC version, and a global CEO announced that we're, as our commitment to these difficult times, we're not going to do any layoffs for the next 90 days. So one of the guys who works locally sent me a message. Now I'm now worried about the 91st day. Are you going to announce layoffs on 91st day? So the intent is great. You provided stability to employees for 90 days. So take pressure off from trying to get that messaging perfect. The second tip I'd say is ask for feedback. This is, Paul, you talked about connection, but to constantly, for leaders to reach out to teams and say, what are you feeling? How did that message resonate with you? What concerns do you have? You'll get a lot of those coming back to you. If you give that message in an all-hands meeting and go away and you're not seeking that feedback, you have no clue what messages they're getting, what the impact it's had for them. So seek that feedback. And the third, I just say is you kind of hit, I call them the 3 Ps of well-being. There's physical well-being, which you talked about. There's the psychological well-being, and the third one is your professional well-being. It's time to keep employees engaged, keep them learning, just because they're off in there. So provide learning opportunities, whether it's virtual or not. Provide opportunities for employees to learn new skills, be agile, provide backups for each other. So that'll also create that sense of purpose moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Vinay. Professor Raghu, any comments on how you balance that message, how you keep people engaged through an extended crisis like we're facing right now?
Right. So, these days are moments of existential crisis. Everybody is worrying about, do they have a cough? How is the body temperature? And as you rightly said, everybody is all by themselves, probably telecommuting, calling up people, talking to them, and they have no clue about where they are heading and what's going to happen. So I think one of the things that actually brings up a lot of positivity in oneself when you're alone is this whole satisfaction of contributing to ideas. And I think if there are discussion groups which are able to post current challenges and if they are given a forum to contribute to ideas, they're able to share information, which obviously they do, and then more importantly, to report mistakes without fear or favor. And I think if that is an environment which is sustained over this period of uncertainty, I think that goes a long way in employees feeling counted and they feel connected. Yeah.
So, Professor Raghu, there's an interesting concept called psychic or social equity. It's commonly referred to that emotional connection that you make with your team or your organization. It can happen in sports, it can happen in a business environment as well. So psychic equity comes from that genuineness, the feeling that I belong, that I'm cared for, that my voice is heard, and so on. And then I have a leader that I can trust and that trusts me, that cares about me. So this is actually a moment, if I go back to that question about how do you prepare for the future, actually we're in a good situation now to kind of build that bond with our colleagues. In a way, we're more in touch now that we're separated than we've ever been. Couple tactical things I'd like to share with you. We're constantly thinking about back to my BCP story. So we kick off with, are our people safe? What's the latest data out there? We share that with everyone. Of course, then we get into messaging. So it's very important that leaders all walk out of that room giving exactly the same message to the organization. That's critical to make sure people feel safe and of course cared for, and transparency, right? The worst thing that a leadership team can do through this crisis is to give mixed messages. And I will tell you, I personally have zero tolerance for leaders on my team that would share information that's not true, for example, or not validated, not verified. And I think WhatsApp, on one hand, can be our friend. It can also be our worst enemy. And we've seen that with the spreading of rumors, and even India, the government is taking steps to try to prevent that. But when leaders do it, it's amplified. And it's very important that leaders show maturity during this crisis. But again, back to some practical things we do. We talk about in our BCP meeting some engagement activities that we can do. So I talked about physical and mental and emotional health. And so, I start the day with a little workout, and just, you don't need any gear, you don't need any fancy stuff. You can just do some basic activities. And so I make mini videos with my son, who's also in lockdown mode here, my teenage son. He takes the video for me. He's my director and producer. And it's a short 2-3 minute video where I just show a couple of my favorite exercises that I do to kick off the day. And I'm making this series of Fitness Corner with the CEO. And then we release that to the whole company. Well, it's great. Our viewership is higher than it's ever been for our internal mailers like this. And then people are actually doing it. Then they're taking selfies of themselves doing these activities as well. So, that's kind of a neat outcome of that's emerged from this. We also came up with another idea, which you may want to try. We're just about to launch it, called Randstad Radio. And you could, of course, do it in your own company and call it whatever your company name is, radio. And it's a chance to leverage technology. A lot of technologies out there, like this one right here, a lot that are free, by the way, where you can open up an hour, maybe a couple times, 3 times a week, whatever it's going to be, where the entire company can access this link, and somebody on the team can be the DJ. And then, of course, it's not just about playing music, it's about having some fun. You can do live online quizzes and things like that. We're doing something interesting where our leadership team, senior leadership team, are sharing their favorite songs and a little story behind it. And then the DJ will say, hey, I'm going to play a bit of this song. You have to guess what it is and guess which leader says this is his or her favorite song, and then tell a story about it. Our global CEO in Amsterdam has offered to join in as a special surprise guest, and we'll bring him in as well, along with other external surprise guests. So these are small things, but they're big things, particularly when you're in an extended lockdown like we are right now. So mixing it up, I'm a big fan of that. I think we need to mix it up a little bit, the way we engage. All of that sets us up for the next stage. Let me talk a little bit from the commercial standpoint. While this is all good, engagement is good, that doesn't pay the bills. Huh? We know as business leaders, we have businesses to protect and of course, continue to run and eventually accelerate when the bounce back happens. Any of us that led through the global financial crisis know what happens after a crisis. Now, this is very different. I'm not going to compare apples to apples, but you know that when you come out of it, there's a bounce back. It's natural. The question is how long that takes, how big that curve is going to be. So it's also very important, and there's a question here about that, and I'm just going to read it because it's something that I'm dealing with right now in my own organization. It's about how do you maintain productivity? And let me just bring up the actual question. Just give me, here we are. The question comes from Swati at KRDS, HR executive. The question is, what steps can leaders take to instill a sense of urgency and seriousness in their people through this crisis? In other words, how do we get them to do work? How do we get them to be productive now that we know they're safe, right? They're connected, they're engaged. The next phase is productivity. How do we do that? Any thoughts on this one? And this is, there's no textbook answer. There's no Bible for this one. How do we now get productivity in the middle of a crisis when we're working remotely? Who wants to give this one a shot?
So I can go. I mean, this is a tough one.
All right, Vinay, give it a shot.
The reality I'm hearing, and I hear it from my colleagues in my organization, and my wife's working, and she talks about it as well. I think people are a lot more busier when they're working from home. So I'm not sure if productivity has gone up, but you've got to find the right things for people to be working on. If it is, let's fix this process that we haven't had time to work on in the last 6 months because we've been so busy, you've got to give a why is this process important? How is it going to help us post this crisis? So one is that sense of purpose of what people are working on. Second is the concept of productivity when you're face-to-face and physically co-located teams to virtual changes. I'm hearing a lot about remote and virtual managers micromanaging a lot more. People are telling me that, my manager used to connect with me once or twice a day in the office. Now they're pinging me once an hour just to make sure I'm working, right? Yeah. To see if I'm in front of the computer. I think it's got to be a lot more outcome-based productivity. What are the tasks that we are finishing? What is the purpose of this task? And what is the value add of it? So I think we need to move to an outcome-based productivity, not an hour-based productivity.
Yeah, interesting. Professor Raghu, any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
How we keep people engaged, but also.
I think the one who placed the question knows it is far more tougher to actually work from home than to work from the office. And that's a huge realization, at least for men. I don't know about women understand that, but for men, it is like God. Now, the second thing is, as Mr. Vinay rightly said, this whole idea of being on the supply side and not watching the demand side is a mindset shift that most managers actually require. That these days of micromanaging essentially have to be seen to the end, because basically it is all about outcomes now. And there is no way that remotely you can actually look at the computer and it's on time and what they are doing and all of that. And instead of that, the orientation basically is about output and outcome. And this whole business of trying to check productivity by micromanaging has to somehow go away. So it's a hard call, but I think if this persists for a period of time, then there might be some changes in practices.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree. You hit on something that I'm very passionate about. In fact, even in our leadership team, BCP team meeting this morning, first thing at 9 o'clock, I talked about how do we, it's not about productivity, it's about mission. You know, think about it. When we're the most motivated is when we wake up in the morning, we have a mission. We have a reason to get up that day and do something that's going to move the needle, that's going to make an impact, that's going to impact the world. And we need to ensure that our people have a compelling mission. And, you know, it's not about ticking boxes. It's not about moving piles of sand. Nobody's interested in that. Huh? We want to do something with meaning. And so I think leaders right now need to focus on things that you can do to engage your people and to have them feel like they're on a mission. They're on a mission, and we'll get through this together. But while we're on this mission, we're also going to do something that's going to move the needle. And that's a challenge for leaders. That's the challenge, in fact, that I issued to my own leadership team today, is to come up with that mission. Vinay?
Yeah, this is the best time for teams and organizations to be innovative, to create innovative methods, innovative products, innovative solutions, because you're being forced. I mean, the environment is going to make you has to make you innovative. So this is a great time to enable people to try out new things, new processes, new systems.
Experiments. It's a great time to do experiments. We have something we call a Shark Tank based on the TV show, The Shark Tank. You can do Shark Tank. You can issue an experiment, do like a hackathon approach to a problem, to maybe a non-IT problem or an IT problem. Have teams work together and then present to the leadership team. I've got my eye on the clock. There's a lot of questions here, but there's one here that's specific to, to people, and particularly the workforce. And this is not only within the Indian context, it's certain global. The future is uncertain. This is from Shamil Sharma. Sorry, I don't have the company name. Shamil Sharma. The future is uncertain. The worst is expected. Layoffs, especially contractual labor, temp staffing. Companies like Randstad will face this. Should companies start planning for this downsizing of their workforce and the saving of costs? It's a very important question, considering the business that we are in. We are in the business of helping people find gainful employment, the right employment, of course, helping organizations grow, partnering with organizations to grow. You know, I caution, and I talk to CEOs and CHROs daily now because there is concern. How can we sustain this when people are not productive? How can we cover the costs? And personnel expenses, PE expenses are going to be your biggest expense on most of our P&Ls. You know, how do we handle that? I think, you know, my sense is that, and I talk to companies again daily, is that no one is going to downsize radically, partly because they're looking at what happens after the crisis. With temporary and contractual laborers, the 30 days notice then comes with the offboarding. To then have them onboarded again, that's a bit of a risk. And so we hear things like force majeure and so on, but I caution companies on that one. We have an obligation at Randstad to take care of our 60,000 plus contractors here in India. And I see them as individuals with families, with dependents, with needs and so on. We need to make sure they have gainful employment. What I do know is that while some companies will have a rough road ahead, particularly in the weeks and months ahead, there are other companies that are actually hiring. So when you downsize your workforce, we talk about workforce planning. The fluidity of that suggests that you might want to reduce your number of contractual workers. Well, the chances that some of those workers will then be deployed to another company that's upsizing. So there is a bit of opportunity cost in this as well. I do think, though, it's a kind of a tripartite arrangement, or even perhaps four-way. When you think about the government needs to support, and the Indian government is doing that. Some other governments around the world now are putting in safety nets for people who might lose their jobs during the crisis. A company like Randstad as well needs to be committed to protecting these people and ensuring they have gainful employment. I think also the companies out there, you know, all of you who are representing companies need to think about that psychic equity and social equity I talked about earlier. Some short-term pain will lead to long-term gain. You'll reduce attrition. You will have ultimately more productivity. So I think it's a tough decision to make. I do see, though, more companies are pausing their permanent hiring, so their core full-time employee hiring, and they're focusing more on contractual workers because of the nature of, you know, fluidity and mobility. But I would caution companies from doing a massive downsize when it comes to people, because this is a moment of truth. And by the way, memories are long, and this does affect employer branding as well, because when the crisis ends, you're going to want to accelerate, you're going to want to hire people, and how you respond in this crisis will be critical. I look at the clock. We have 5 minutes left. I want to just go to both Vinay and Professor Raghu, just as we get ready to wrap up here. A really good discussion, by the way. I should tell you as well, by the way, we have more than 500 people on this webinar, which is a world record. I'm absolutely amazing. And I also must say, that one surprised you, eh, Vinay?
Hey, 500. I didn't fall off the. Yeah, I didn't fall off the chair. I dropped my laptop.
That's okay. You were celebrating. And by the way, it's crossing borders. This is not just in the beauty of technology and the internet. We've got people from North America. We've got people from Japan, Singapore, India, and so on, from all over. So thank you all for joining. I just want to come to some final comments from each of you. So Vinay, you've talked about some of the do's and don'ts and so on. Maybe any tip you'd like to leave people, maybe a golden nugget or a book people should read, or an article, or something you'd like to share with people as a takeaway.
Sure. The tip I'd like to leave is for leaders and HR and any professional. This is the opportunity to think about the legacy you want to leave as a leader. This moment will define it. This is the defining moment. In terms of references, actually, with my free time, I've started reading again. And there's 2 books that I just want to call out. One is The Power of Moments. And it's funny you mentioned that earlier. We didn't plan this, Paul. But The Power of Moments, Why Certain Experiences Have Tremendous Impact by Chip and Dan Heath. A brilliant book. And Paul, without plugging your book, it's Your E5 Moment, the book that you wrote, which I read it again. It's not out yet, but I read my draft copy, which is again gives people that structure of thinking about how do you structure your leadership, right? We all need a frame for what we're doing right now, and that helps.
Well, thank you. We'll share the link to the first book. The second one, thank you for that plug. My first book is coming out soon. Thank you. It's actually quite timely and talks a lot about my experiences in leadership across borders, and a bit of crisis management is in there as well. Thanks, Vinay. And Professor Raghu, same question. If you think about tips or a book or an article someone should read as a takeaway from this call.
All right. I think the primary thing, as you were just mentioning, the basic idea of bouncing back is all about resilience. And there is a book called The Resilient Organization: How Adaptive Cultures Thrive When Strategy Fails. And I think that's a pretty good read, contextually speaking, written, of course, by a professor from Helsinki School of Economics, Lisa Valkangas. And what it basically discusses is, how do you bet on resilience and not just on strategy? And more resilient parts of your organization are, more does the whole perform. And therefore, how do you manage the consequences of the past, and why leadership matters, but more importantly, why the responsive system that he engages with matters much more. So how do you make the organization more resourceful, robust, adaptive, and what are the building blocks of organizational resilience? I think that could be a pretty good read for anybody who is facing up to challenges today.
Very interesting. I'm a big fan of Grit, of course, the TED Talk. Where this idea of resilience, bouncing back. This is a muscle that we're all building right now, and I'm sure when we come out of this, we'll talk a lot more about it. On that note, it's exactly 12 o'clock here in India, and we promised you 1 hour of discussion. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I know I did. I want to say thank you, Professor Raghu and Vinay, for joining in this conversation, and the fact that more than 500 people joined and stayed with us right to the very end. We appreciate that very much. Thank you. On that note, I wish you all good health and stay safe. We have challenging days ahead, but I'm absolutely confident that we will get through this, of course, and we'll be stronger together as leaders. All the best, and have a great day. Thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.